Hello, my name's Rob Haddam, and this is the second part of my presentation titled Teachers Working with Funds of Knowledge. This second presentation will revisit the rationale that I provided in part one, continue to elaborate on what I'm calling a relational view of pedagogy that sets up the argument for funds of knowledge, and then I'll elaborate some funds of knowledge approaches and mostly share my understanding of the original funds of knowledge approach worked out in the southern states of America, and how some South Australian educators have borrowed and bent that approach to our specific context. So here's the basic rationale. My rationale started with arguing that some key challenges for public school teachers in Australia could be understood around these sorts of notions. Teachers really struggle with how they set their students with hard things to do, but then sustain positive educational relationships. Often these two seem to be in sort of inverse relation, and it seems as though in some classrooms it's impossible to have both of those things, in which case what tends to happen is to maintain some sort of educative relationship, then teachers tend to give away the sort of challenging curriculum, and we end up offering curriculum that's hasn't got high intellectual cognitive expectations. Or to put this sort of differently, how do we engage our students successfully when we do offer them hard things to do? Before we get to, what we might do with that, it's clear that the sort of dominant traditional forms of teaching, and I call those by names like transmission, there's sort of a transmission from the teacher to the student that somehow or other understood to be a blank slate. We could call it sort of monologic teaching. There's really only one voice in the room, it's the teachers. When we look at these, they're sort of highly scripted performances. Some critical educators call it banking education. It's clear that these approaches don't work actually, and so we need to be thinking about some alternative. And one way to think about the alternatives to invoke this concept of the turnaround. The idea of turnaround pedagogies comes from some colleagues of ours in South Australia, Barb Comer in particular. The basic proposition here is if we're struggling with our challenge as outlined above, we really need to be getting past deficit views of young people in our classrooms, and the sort of a deficit view assumes some lack. The students are lacking something, and rather than a theories of lack, what they don't bring to school, don't bring to class, thinking about an assets-based approach or a strengths-based approach, in which case we're trying to work with what knowledges, experiences, or capabilities our students do bring to class. Let's play with that. In which case, again, if we're trying to confront the challenges I've outlined above, we really need to be redesigning the relationship between teachers and students. By definition, for me anyway, pedagogy is defined as relationships between students, teacher, and knowledge and identity. So what the presentation's really about is how we might think about redesigning this relationship between student, teacher, knowledge, and identity. In which case, if we try and highlight an assets-based approach, then there's multiple vocabularies here that we can bring to the table, and I've outlined these in the previous presentation. Negotiating, there's a sense of connectedness in the Queensland productive pedagogies. There's funds of knowledge, local literacies, place-based pedagogies, the multi-literacies project, Irishaw's situated pedagogy. You get wonderful examples of this in arts-based curriculum and pedagogies. We can think about Indigenous perspectives or culturally responsive pedagogy. All of these invoke some notion of how we might connect up young people's lives to the curriculum. So connecting lives and learning becomes one of the sort of key tropes here. and for the benefit of some future work. On this slide, I've hyperlinked each of those concepts to at least one text that you could use to follow up on any of these ideas. While we're talking about pedagogy, then, in my own thinking and my own sort of development in this area, about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a review of research into middle schooling that Alan Luke and a range of his colleagues published. So 2003, so that's almost 20 years ago. Their own sort of examination of research literature internationally indicated these sort of characteristics for pedagogies that foster high levels of student engagement. And again, if we go back to the basic challenge, the challenge that I'm trying to sort of foreground here is how do teachers engage young people in high quality learning that enables them to be successful at school? That's another way of framing up the question. So we can see here a whole number of dot points, but the one or two that I want to sort of draw out as what I think are sort of the key ideas that drive this whole approach is the second one, trying to make real world connections to community problems or issues, and trying to support students having some autonomy and choice in what goes on in class. I think these are sort of two fundamental propositions that sort of drive this approach. We can think about the second one and maybe we can expand what's meant there, but let's just move on to introduce the notion of funds of knowledge. A key text in the funds of knowledge literature is this one edited by Norma Gonzalez, Luis Moll and Kathy Amate. I think there's copies of this in the library, but quotes from a subsequent paper that sort of outlines their approach, just to read this out. What we refer to as funds of knowledge is a key theoretical concept in our work. A critical assumption in our work is that educational institutions have stripped away the view of working class minority students as emerging from households rich in social and intellectual resources. This is their sort of way into thinking about how the sort of knowledges that students do bring to class are too often ignored by what counts as knowledge in school. So rather than focusing on the knowledge these students bring to school and using it as a foundation for learning, the emphasis has been on what these students lack. So again, you can see how we've got this account of how sort of deficit logic works in schooling. And here's a brief summary of the funds of knowledge approach, the original approach. So the original approach had sort of three stages. In the first stage, this group hired an ethnographer, Norma Gonzalez, to study the origin, use and distribution of what they were calling funds of knowledge among households in predominantly Mexican working class communities in Arizona. And then the second phase was to convene groups, study groups with teachers, where the teachers were then shared with the ethnographic research, and then provided with opportunities to discuss the findings and to plan, develop and support some innovations in their own instruction based on the ethnographic research. And then schools engage in trying out different forms of instruction on the basis of having access to the ethnographic funds of knowledge research. So for me, there were sort of three main phases here. There's sort of an ethnography of community funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge in this case is defined very specifically as local household knowledge that local households use to function economically. Teachers work with this version of funds of knowledge to redesign their curriculum, and then they enact that with their students. That's the sort of the basic approach. So about 15 years ago or more, a large research team of UDSA researchers just were involved in what was called the Redesigning Pedagogy in the North project, and the North being the northern suburbs of Adelaide. It was an Australian Research Council funded study that was a collaboration between us and and the 10 public secondary schools. The aim was to redesign middle years curriculum and pedagogy that both engages students and enables academic success. The approach was to build units of curriculum work that incorporated, and we're using local community knowledge instead of funds of knowledge here, to engage students through meaningful connection with their lives, scaffolded learning that includes explicit acquisition of cultural capital needed for mainstream academic success. And as we go on to say here, we were borrowing the funds of knowledge approach, but we didn't actually engage with direct ethnographic research in families. Instead, we involved teachers in negotiating curriculum projects with students that involved classroom investigations into their own communities. So rather than hiring the ethnographers, the class itself became the site for producing knowledge about their life worlds and their communities. That was the basic proposition. So our approach, translating funds of knowledge to our context, the first phase was thinking about connecting student life worlds to learning. And because we worked with teachers across the curriculum, then each curriculum area needs to think specifically about what that actually means. We expanded, we were, rather than use funds of knowledge as the key concept, we were using student life world knowledges. And underneath that, funds of knowledge was one example, place, vernacular literacy, popular culture, out of school learning, and subsequently we've added culture and language. The second phase, teachers redesign curriculum in response to one of those or more than that, and then they enact a funds of knowledge curriculum with their students. Now, the sort of process for actually doing the redesign and the rethinking and so on is its own project in some ways. And the South Australian variation uses a 1-year action research cycle that has these 4 processes. In term 1, there's what we're calling a provocation phase, in which case there's a conversation set up between teachers and academic researchers around what are their challenges and introducing them to some ideas from this sort of expanded version of funds of knowledge. They then, like the original approach, spend some time redesigning a unit of work in response to the provocation. They then teach the unit sometime in the 3rd term, except in our case, they actually do some action research, in which case they collect some data that enables us to work out what actually went on and did that make a difference. And then finally, there's a what did you learn phase, which in our case involved the public performance of learning by the teachers, which then feeds into what are we going to do in the following year. So again, just to sort of reiterate my sort of relational theory of pedagogy, just to bring some of this together here. By definition, pedagogy's it's a relationship between students and teachers, but it's a very specific relationship. It's not any old relationship. It involves a mediation of knowledge in the first instance, and if we think really carefully about what goes on in pedagogical relationships, then there's both the teachers and the students are involved in ongoing identity work. Their sense of self is changing as a consequence of the mediation of knowledge. Now for us, if we use this model, then it's possible to actually map on there, what the students and the teachers bring to the encounter. Again, the traditional approach tends to foreground the text that's in green here. It's just the traditional approaches to pedagogy foreground almost entirely what the teacher brings to the encounter and spends very little time thinking about what the student brings. And the students bring their own discipline knowledge, which has its own vocabulary and has decades and decades, if not centuries of understanding, knowledge about what deep understandings are required. There's just very specific skills that are required in disciplines, certain understandings, and each discipline has its own specific literate practices and numeracy. Now, if we're sort of committed to a sort of an assets-based approach to teaching, then we need to be elaborating what the students bring. In which case, this is where this other knowledge that's in the yellow slide here, which I've already stated in part one and in the last few minutes. We won't have to repeat those, but let's just elaborate on each of those very, very quickly. So when we go to the funds of knowledge approach, by definition, funds of knowledge assumes that people, our students, are competent and they have knowledge and that their life experiences have given them that knowledge. So the funds of knowledge approach really does start from a basic proposition that our students are knowledgeable, and that's the basis for the pedagogical encounter. There's not an assumption that they're just clean slates coming into class that we just ride onto. Pat Thompson, a previous colleague of ours, she coined the term the virtual school bag as a way of thinking about a positive content for the knowledges that students bring to school. And a rhetorical question here: if students aren't learning how to study their own lives at school, then what is the point? We can think about place-based studies, and again, there's this very large archive of place-based studies in education. From a standpoint of local knowledge, this approach analyses more abstract knowledge from familiar places. It documents regional cultures, maps community assets, researches local environmental phenomena, gets students to identify and investigate school community issues, and creates internship and entrepreneurial opportunities for students to think through relations between vocations and their place. Can we see how that is? So too often the curriculum's not really focused on the local place, and we sort of lose our way in decontextualized forms of knowing. We can elaborate further on some sort of basic elements of place-based approaches. Teachers and students focus on immediate phenomena as the foundation for curriculum. Probably we could say that early childhood educators do this, and then as we move away from early childhood further up the the years of schooling, then we forget about the importance of knowing being located. There's an emphasis on student learning that allows students to be creators of knowledge rather than just consumers. A place-based curriculum, the students' questions and concerns play a central role in what's studied. So there's a negotiation right at the level of what do students want to know. Teachers act as guides and co-learners and brokers of community resources and learning possibilities. And we could say that the wall between school and community becomes more permeable and is crossed more frequently. We could think about vernacular literacies, a sort of local literacies approach. So a local literacies approach provides students with opportunities to make connections between their own linguistic, cultural, world knowledge and experience and the topic, skills and competencies demanded by the official curriculum. And perhaps to quote McLaughlin here, having an interest in local literacies, teachers recognise their students as master interpreters and canny theorists of their own cultures. Again, that circles back to the notion of students being knowledgeable in the funds of knowledge approach. We could shift to how students' involvement in popular culture becomes a resource for thinking about funds of knowledge that students bring. Certainly, we can all reflect on how our own sense of self is being constituted and formed inside of our own engagement in music and film and our own cultural experiences. So educators can't assume that students are passive receptors of media, popular culture or youth, nor can we assume that they'll be interested in any part of youth culture. There is a risk that popular culture is used to engage or entertain students, but it does not necessarily stretch them academically, in which case curriculum planning needs to consider how studying youth and popular culture can teach skills and provide academic rigour. The power of popular culture needs to be open to ongoing critique. And then, of course, young people are all engaged in out-of-school learning sites. So I think too often teachers assume that students are only learning at school, which of course is it couldn't be further from the truth. And this becomes sort of a general set of dot points that I want to share here about the way a more expanded version of funds of knowledge could work here. So if we're adopting a more expanded version of funds of knowledge, i.e. life world knowledges that students bring to school, and try to think about what we might do curriculum and pedagogically, these things I think emerge. So we're all trying to find creative ways to learn about what's most existential for our students. What is it that's a concern for them and their lives, and their lives and the places they live? Being able to negotiate with students, then how we negotiate becomes a very, very important pedagogical capability. How we might establish the classroom as a research centre, enabling students to conduct their own inquiries. And again, back to the sort of original funds of knowledge approach, they hired professional ethnographers. I think what we're arguing here is that the classroom itself becomes more ethnographic in its own orientation. So students learn to become expert researchers and knowledge producers. I think, unfortunately, historically, when we think about students doing research in school, mostly all they're doing is retrieving already existing knowledge and rehearsing it over and over and over, never finding out how to produce their own knowledge. So this approach is sort of shifting from rehearsing already existing knowledge into providing opportunities for young people to produce their own knowledge about their own lives and their own communities, and pushing up to even, the sort of global challenges that we're all worried about. There's providing space for students to develop their own capacity as canny theorists of their own cultures, and providing them then to produce for opportunities to take an active role in addressing the specific social issues that they've identified. We can shift to a culturally responsive approach, and perhaps we can see here, again, mostly dot points we've already mentioned, but perhaps if we zoom in on the third one, the culturally responsive approach focuses on young people's cultural experiences, and in some cases, in some classrooms, it'll be their cultural difference. I think, unfortunately, again, traditionally, cultural difference is often seen as an impediment to learning, which interferes with the learning of large numbers of young people in schools. So there's sort of, again, a reframe around the deficit discourses around cultural difference, to be thinking about how we can structure classrooms in which cultural differences become an asset for everyone's learning in the class. We could spend more time on how we understand culture here, but that's probably for another time. Just want to now move to quickly give some sort of examples here, because that's, so far, it's all rather abstract. In the Ribbon study, we worked with 30 teachers, and again, the key trope here was, how do we connect student lives with learning? So the notion of strong connectedness became a really, really foundational proposition, sort of driving the sort of innovation. So here were some examples of what teachers got up to when they were provided with our abstract ideas. A science teacher who's committed to studying food and diet was able to reframe the unit around, the fast food industry, focusing on research on the food that was provided by the school canteen, and connected with a documentary that was very prominent at the time, called Super Size Me, which was a documentary around the sort of deleterious effect of too much fast food on people's health. One teacher, an art teacher, set up a unit of clay animation in which young people were provided, her students were provided with a task of coming up with a non-violent resolution to some community issues, which was a serious issue of the life worlds of many of the students in this class. Our history teacher set a task of writing biographies of an older family member, in which case the students were learning about history, but they were generating histories of their own families. There's so many examples of popular culture, young people involving in body piercing and self-mutilation, studying punk music and anarchy, and certain cultural subgroups, the goths and emos, which were strongly evident in classrooms 15 or 20 years ago. There's using the local community for research. There's designing mathematics around how we might redesign local recreation areas, which were really significant for some young people in these classrooms. There was peer tutoring to form a band and play rock songs, learning how to interview experts in high interest areas, doing science on the local wetlands, examining the use of mobile phones, doing research and presentations on youth culture and identity formation, developing photo stories and literacy work around personal and cultural stories for people living in the local community. And we can go on and on and on with many, many examples, but the key proposition here that I'd like to make is I think the good teacher that we're trying to argue here is or taking responsibility for doing their own curriculum work, in which case trying to craft curricula that's directly related to the life worlds of their students. If you wanted more examples, there's 9 or 10 chapters in our book, Connecting Lives and Learning, which again, a book that's available in the local library, where some of these examples are actually described in some detail. And I've mentioned, connecting up Year 9 mathematics to local community issues. Chapter 3, the curriculum, the science curriculum on Supersize Me in Chapter 4. And there's many, many other examples there that are worthwhile following up. If you want to look at some examples of how teachers have been using culturally responsive approaches, then you could check out the Culturally Responsive Pedagogy website, which has about 15 or 20 case studies which elaborate 2 years of action research projects using cultural difference as the sort of key fund of knowledge. Here's the sort of Supersize Me example, which it's the sort of transdisciplinary science unit, and I'll just quickly pass through some of these slides. I guess the interesting thing, circling back to what I'd said about 10 minutes ago, certainly in high schools, teaching is organised around subject disciplines. There's maths, science, English, HASS, art. Each of these curriculum areas have their own sort of specific teaching challenges and content, and each of them requires teachers to think carefully about how connectedness actually works. Certainly it's more difficult in Year 11 and Year 12, but there's an enormous amount of scope and possibility for teachers working in the middle years, where the curriculum's really been designed to enable teachers to work out how the Australian curriculum can be translated into this and be connected to the lives of their specific students. You can see there was a teacher who did a unit around a TV series called Buffy that was very, very important years ago. There's mobile phone use. There's using a negotiated approach to English. There's doing middle school mathematics around community issues, and I've already mentioned the clay animation example. And maybe just to round out the presentation then, what we're talking about here is redesigning curriculum and pedagogy. This is about teachers claiming their own professional autonomy to be designing curriculum and pedagogy that engages the unique students that they find themselves teaching in the schools that they're in. The one-size-fits-all highly ritualised performances fail, and unless teachers actually craft curriculum that can connect up with the unique students in their class, I can't see how we can be improving learning outcomes in this country. Anyway, what we are talking about here is we're talking about shifting the relationships between teachers and students, and I think one of the key contours here is rather than the teachers making all the major decisions and having the power over what goes on in class, we're arguing here for a shift towards a co-construction of learning between teachers and students, in which case we're offering students more choice in what's going on in class. There's very, very thoughtful curriculum design work going on here where we're connecting up to the life worlds of the students. We're trying to set engaging learning tasks that are also demand high intellectual challenge. Something we haven't mentioned here, which I think makes some of this a virtuous circle, is if we push towards demanding some performance of learning, then I think that certainly can have positive influences on student motivation for learning. There's also a need to be developing a vocabulary to talk about redesigning pedagogy, and I suppose for the most of my presentation anyway, the vocab that I'm interested in enlarging is a vocabulary around what knowledges do young people bring to class that we can work with. And in the middle of all of this, of course, there's something which is very significant for the sort of politics of teachers' work. We need to be thinking about professional learning that's focused on providing teachers with opportunities to work on the problems that they name, rather than implementing professional learning that supports the problems that are named by policy. I think we've already done that one. I'm sorry, we've doubled up on that slide. And perhaps just one more slide then. If we're thinking more broadly about a sort of meta-analysis of my presentations, I'm wanting to argue here that we're all responsible for contesting the narrowing of the purposes of education, which seems to be now quite evident in Australian schooling. I'm hoping that my presentations provided some way of thinking about how we might go about doing that. We need to keep alive alternative proposals that are informed by decades of research into social justice and schooling. Unfortunately, we find ourselves now in Australia, in which case the major jurisdictions of policy are deliberately ignoring decades of research into social justice and schooling, because the equity debates are now put to one side, unfortunately. And we need to be resisting being treated as technicians, in which case the policy logic is now demanding our compliance rather than providing teachers with opportunities for enlarging their professional autonomy. And I've been arguing for the last 40 minutes or so for advancing research into educators' experiments that focus on how teachers and students co-construct their learning that is strongly connected to the existential concerns of their communities. And just the sort of final slide, I can only encourage you to be spending more time with whoever you can to think about what sorts of pedagogies you're advocating for. And my dot points are, I'm advocating for pedagogies that demand high intellectual challenge, that are dialogical in nature, that are improvisational in the jazz sense, in which case the teachers and the students are literally making up what goes on in class in real time, that are culturally safe and responsive to the cultural differences that are evident in the room, and that the primary focus of our teaching is to develop critically literate active citizens. Thank you very much.